Are you ready for the Word?
Yes, sir.
We will be looking at Galatians 2 by way of 2 Peter 3. And I say 2 Peter 3 because I think it's impossible to study the writings of Paul without almost continuously referring back to the warning that Peter gave us about the writings of Paul. He said that they are hard to be understood. Hard to be understood in King James Version, it says hard to be understood. That word actually means extremely hard. Very difficult to understand some of the writings of Paul. And he said this about the writings of Paul. Not only are they hard to be understood, but he said they get twisted. Again, the King James word is rest, W-R-E-S-T. They become twisted, perverted. That word actually means to take something and to put so much pressure on twisting it that you turn it completely around. You reverse it so that it means the very opposite of what it was actually meant to say. Strong says the word means to wrench, which is really a reference to a torture device where you put something in it and you wrench it. So he's saying that people take the writings of Paul and stretch them to a point of torture. But also think about the English word we even use today, wrench. What is a wrench?
Something to turn something.
You take it and put it on a bolt and you can turn it. You couldn't turn it by hand, but if you get enough leverage with a wrench, you can twist it and turn it. And so, again, Peter says people who are unlearned and unstable do that with the writings of Paul. They take his words and they put leverage on them, and then leverage being their own preconceived ideas and their own doctrines, and they twist them and make them say the very opposite of what Paul meant for them to say. He used the word unlearned, and if you look in 2 Peter 3:17, it's clear to see that what he means by unlearned is somebody who doesn't know the law or doesn't know Torah. But he also used the word unstable. And I do want you to look in 2 Peter 2:14 for just a moment. In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter's warning about false prophets, false preachers, false teachers, and he has a whole lot of things to say about them. And none of it is complimentary. He doesn't like them. He doesn't like what they do. He doesn't cut them any slack. 2 Peter 2:14, he says this about them. He said, they beguile unstable souls. This word translated unstable is the same word he used in 2 Peter chapter 3. But notice he said false teachers beguile unstable souls. In 2 Peter 3, he said the unstable ones are the ones who twist the writings of Paul. To beguile means to use a decoy in order to trap or capture something. So Peter says they use decoys to capture unstable souls. Decoys, we've talked about this before, have to look real enough to fool unsuspecting victims. They have to be close enough to real that the unsuspecting think it is real. In other words, what Peter's warning us about is people who can preach from the Bible and never preach the Bible. They'll use Bible verses that decoy what they're saying, and it makes them look like they're preaching the Bible, but they're not. They're preaching from it. They're not actually preaching the Bible. They're using Bible words to trap souls and get them to believe unbiblical things. This week I went on YouTube just to see what mainstream denominations are preaching and teaching about Galatians. Because after you've been out of it for a while, you kind of forget. To say that I was shocked by some of the things they're saying about the writings of Paul would be an understatement. Yesterday I was listening to a man who has a fairly large congregation. It's up in Oregon. He has a YouTube channel that has over 55,000 subscribers. So a lot of people tuning in regularly to listen to what this man says. And he was teaching through the book of Galatians. And in yesterday's message I was listening to, he was teaching out of Galatians 5, and here's what he said, and this is a direct quote. Legalism is disobedience to God. Now, I listened to him long enough this week to understand precisely what he meant by that statement. What he meant by that statement is anyone who attempts to obey Torah is disobeying Yahweh. Any attempt to obey is to disobey. This is what Peter was warning about, the beguiling of souls, the capturing of souls. Teaching people and getting them to buy into the fact that if you try to obey Yahweh, you're disobeying Yahweh and you're in trouble. Earlier in the week, he was teaching from Galatians 3, and he mentioned how that Yahweh had given the children of Israel the law at Mount Sinai. And he said the children of Israel said, when they heard the law, they said, we will obey it. Direct quote. He said, that was the dumbest thing they could have ever said. The dumbest thing they could have ever said is, yes, we will obey. Now, Yahweh's offering them an opportunity to come into covenant with Him. And this man says they were dumb to agree to it. He uses Bible teaching to trap souls and get them to believe unbiblical things. He uses Bible verses as decoys to trap souls, and then conditions them through his teachings to reject Torah. Again, that's the very thing Peter's warning us about. Peter said in 2 Peter 3, beware lest you be carried away with the error of the wicked. The error, and that word wicked means literally, Strong says it means to be a criminal. What is a criminal? A lawbreaker. So Peter said that you can get carried away with the error of lawbreakers, the lawless. Beware lest you get seduced into that. Peter's warning about the writings of Paul couldn't be more clear. So let me go over them real quick. It's threefold warning. Number one, he says some things Paul wrote are hard to be understood. Number two, he said some of the things Paul wrote get twisted by the unlearned and unstable. And the twisting of Paul's words leads people to their own destruction. In other words, it's not a minor thing to twist Paul's writings. To twist Paul's writings can lead to you being destroyed. The third thing he said is that those who twist Paul's words are criminals, they're lawless people, and they can seduce you into this lawlessness, so you need to beware of it. Well, we're studying Galatians. So what I want to do this morning is just real quickly go through several verses. We're going to cherry pick some verses, and we're going to see some things that Paul said that are exactly what Peter mentioned. Hard to be understood. Look in Galatians 2:14. Galatians 2:14, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, he's talking about Peter and Barnabas, I said unto Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, lived after the manner of the Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Now this is one that could easily be twisted. If you read that verse, if somebody, let me say it that way, if someone reads that verse and says, well, I don't think it could be more clear. It's just as clear as it could be that Gentiles don't have to live as the Jews, and Jews kept the law, so that means we don't have to keep the law. If you read that and that's the conclusion you come to, you miss the very warning that Peter gave you. Because Peter said what he writes is hard to be understood, and here's what he meant by that. You read that and think it's saying that a Gentile doesn't have to live as a Jew. A Gentile, therefore, doesn't have to keep the law. Peter said that absolutely makes no sense because it was written by a man who kept the law and who preached the law. So it's hard to understand. You have to back away from it and look at it in its context to get the real meaning of what Paul was trying to present to you. Does that make sense? Look in Galatians 2:16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith of Yeshua HaMashiach, even we have believed in Yeshua HaMashiach, that we might be justified by the faith of the Messiah, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. That one should not be hard to understand, but it is by many people. People twist it to say that we should not try to obey Torah. That's not what it says. What it says is you can't keep Torah and get saved. You cannot become justified by doing it. But it doesn't say you shouldn't keep Torah, but that's the way it gets twisted. In verse 19, for I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto Yahweh. Well, what does that mean, I'm dead to the law? What does it mean when Paul said, I'm dead to the law, that I might live unto Yahweh? See what Peter's talking about? Some of the things he wrote are hard to understand. Look in chapter 3, verse 2. This only would I learn of you. Receive ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? People use this one to teach that if you've received the Spirit, you no longer need the law. Verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. See, they say, right there it is. Those who try to keep the law are under a curse. Now do you understand what what Peter meant? Some of the things Paul wrote are hard to be understood. Galatians 3:13. The Messiah has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. They say, see, the law, Torah, was a curse. That's not what it says. But that's the way most people quote it, understand it, and interpret it. Well, the law is a curse, and we got redeemed from that curse. The law is never called a curse. Chapter 3, verse 24. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto the Messiah, that we might be justified by faith. Verse 25. But after that faith is come, we're no longer under a schoolmaster. So follow the line of thinking. If the law was our schoolmaster, and we're no longer under a schoolmaster, then that means we're no longer under the law. We don't have to keep Torah anymore. That's the way it's taught. That's the way it's twisted. The next one shouldn't get twisted, but it does. Galatians 4, verse 8. Howbeit then, when you knew not Yahweh, you did service unto them which by nature are no Elohim. But now, after that ye have known Yahweh, or rather are known of Yahweh, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. So when the unlearned and the unstable read that, what do they think that means? But the unlearned and the unstable take it and say, well, he's talking about the Sabbath, and he's talking about Pentecost, he's talking about Passover, he's talking about unleavened bread, first fruits, Yom Kippur, Yom Teruah, Sukkot. To keep those things, they say, is foolish. In Galatians 4, 21 through 31, Paul uses an illustration in which he contrasts the difference between Ishmael, born of Hagar, and Isaac, born of Sarah. Men use that illustration to say, see, we're like Isaac. We are born to be free from the law. That's the way they take that illustration and interpret it. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith the Messiah has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. They read that summary, and they refer to what is bondage. How do they interpret the word bondage? They say it refers to what? to the law. But at no point is it ever said in the writing of Paul or in the writings anywhere that the law is bondage. But that's how it is interpreted. So I don't understand how it gets twisted, but it does. They teach that the yoke of bondage is Torah. Chapter 5, verse 2. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if ye be circumcised, the Messiah shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. The Messiah has become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. So here's what they do. They take that, they read it, and they say, well, if you try to do any part of the law, then you have to do it all. No man can do it all, so it's foolish to try. This man I've been listening to this week has said that over and over and over again. No man can do it. No man can do it. Foolish to try. No man can do it. Going back to the quote that he made, he said, to say that you will obey it is the dumbest thing ever you could say. When you look at Torah and you say, I can obey that, he said, that's the dumbest thing ever. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All we have to do, they say, is walk in love. It's right there in the writings of Paul. We don't have to keep the law, we just got to walk in love. How many of you have ever heard that said numerous times? Galatians 5:18. If you be led of the Spirit, you're not under the law. Galatians 6:2. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of the Messiah. We fulfill the law, they say, when we help one another. Galatians 6:13. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. So they read that and say, see, no one ever has been able really to keep the law. Verse 14. But YAHWEH forbid that I should glory, except in the cross of our Master, Yeshua HaMashiach, by whom the world is crucified unto me, and I unto the world. So you'll often hear people refer to this. They may not quote it exactly, but they refer to this by saying, I glory in the cross. I'm not concerned with the law. My glory is in the cross. Verse 15, in the Messiah, Yeshua, neither circumcision avails anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creature. So they say keeping any part of the law is no benefit. We're new creatures. That's all that matters, is that we've been made new. We don't have to keep the law anymore. So here's the point. When you read Galatians, it's easy to see that there are some things written that are hard to be understood. And we can see easily, it's easy to see how they could get twisted by the unlearned and the unstable. But it's also easy to see that if you twist these things, you could end up destroying your own soul. To twist them is to come up with a dangerous doctrine. The twisting of these verses leads people into a belief that they are now lawless, free from the law. But we should beware, Peter said. We should be able to read these things and not get seduced by false teachers into believing that Paul was actually teaching us to live lawless. So this morning, rather than going verse by verse, and we're going to go chapter by chapter and verse by verse, and we will look at every one of those things. But this morning, I want to give you 3 ways that we can know that Paul did not teach against Torah. If we enter into Galatians with that understanding, then it'll help us understand the things that are hard to understand. 3 reasons we can know that Paul did not teach against Torah. I mean, these are as sure can be. Reason number 1, by his own personal example. I'm not going to take the time this morning to go through the book of Acts, but I would encourage you to do that for yourself. Read the book of Acts and notice how many times that Paul kept the Sabbath. Notice how many times that he met with and taught the Gentiles on the Sabbath, and would do that for extended periods of time, up to 18 months at a time, every Sabbath in the synagogue teaching Gentiles. Notice how many times that Paul kept the feast and would say to them, I must be in Jerusalem to keep the feast. Another place, let me say this first. Notice that when he went to Jerusalem, the apostles met with him and said, you are being falsely accused. Falsely accused of not keeping Torah and teaching others they don't have to keep Torah. We need you to take an oath to prove to them that that's a falsehood. Notice that Paul gladly took that oath. In Acts 21:24, this is what James said to Paul. Take them, purify yourself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that these things, or those things, whereof they were informed concerning you, are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep Torah. James knew that he kept Torah. The other apostles knew that he kept Torah. And they want to make sure that all know that Paul keeps Torah. And Paul willingly agreed to do what they asked him to do because he was a man that walked orderly and kept Torah. Let's read just one more verse in Acts 24, and then I'm going to move on to reason number 2. Acts 24:14. This is out of Paul's own mouth. Paul said, this I confess unto you, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I YAHWEH of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. Paul said, I believe all things written in the law and in the prophets. Not I used to believe all those things. He says, I used to believe them, I do believe them, I am believing all things written in the law and in the prophets. How can we know that Paul never would teach people that they don't have to keep Torah by his own personal example? He would have been a hypocrite to have kept the Sabbath, kept the feast, take this oath, have another man circumcised. He would have been a hypocrite to do all of that and then tell everybody else, well, y'all don't have to keep it. That would have been hypocritical. All right, reason number 2. By his own personal examination. We went over this briefly last week, but I did so at the end of a very long service, so I want to make sure we got this one. By his own personal examination. In Galatians 2, mark this. If not literally, at least mark it in your mind and in your heart. Verse 1. Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. We took a lot of time to read all of this in the book of Acts last week. In Acts 14, those of the Jews' religion who claimed that they were now believers came down into the region of Galatia and were telling those who had been saved, born again, whatever word you want to use, those who had turned to Yeshua, they were telling them that they were not yet saved unless they got circumcised. Paul and Barnabas had very strong disagreements with them about this. Strong arguments with them about this. The arguments became so heated, it was decided they should go to Jerusalem and get this thing settled with the apostles. Do you have to be circumcised to be saved or not? So Paul and Barnabas and Titus, and I don't know who else, but several of them go up to Jerusalem to get this issue settled. Paul said in Galatians 2:2 that when we arrived, I went in privately to them who were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. Why did Paul go in and talk to these men privately? This is of the utmost importance. He went in and he sat down with Peter, with James, with John, and he said, I shared with them the gospel that I've been preaching. Why did he do it in private? We don't have to guess. He explained it. He said, I did it in private lest I should have run in vain. Lest I should be running or had run in vain. What does that mean? He said, I understood that these men had walked with Yeshua. And the gospel that they preached, they got from Him. Now he said, I got my gospel from Him too. But these men sat down with Him for years. And what they got directly from Him, and they're preaching it. And I understood there's not two gospels. There's not one for the Jews and one for the Gentiles. There's not one for men and one for women. There's not one for the free and one for the slave. There's one gospel. And so I sat down and shared my gospel, the gospel I've been preaching with them. If those two gospels did not match, they are not the ones that had to change.
Right.
They are not the ones who were wrong. They didn't come to me, I went to them. And I'm taking what I preached and I'm measuring it against what they preached. And if what I have been preaching for 14 years didn't match what they had been preaching, then everything I'd done in vain. It was empty, worthless work.
Right.
I don't know that there's a more powerful statement concerning the Apostle Paul than that he makes of himself right there in verse 2. If my gospel didn't match their gospel, then what I had been doing was in vain. Go read now, after hearing him say that, go read the epistles of James. Go read the epistles of Peter and John. They taught that those who had been made righteous by the blood of Yeshua should walk in righteousness. And they defined righteousness as obedience to Torah. Paul said, I made sure that my gospel, their gospel, were identical. Now last week we took the time to read several things from the epistles of James, the epistles of Peter, and the epistle of John to illustrate what they preach. But this morning I just want to remind you of one, and then we'll move on from this point. Go to 1 John 2. Keep in mind in Galatians 2:2, Paul said, if my gospel didn't match their gospel, if what I'm preaching, my message didn't match what they were preaching, then I am preaching in vain. It's empty and worthless. So all we got to do to find out exactly what Paul means by anything he says is go read their gospels or their epistles, because they're not hard to understand, or not as hard to understand. And John said this in 1 John chapter 2 verse 1. My little children, these things write I unto you, that you sin not. And if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Yeshua HaMashiach, the righteous. If you do, rejoice, we've got an advocate, but I'm writing to you that you do not sin. Well, what is sin? How do you know that? 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. Sin is the transgression of the law. John said that himself. Sin is a transgression of the law. So let's take his definition, bring it over into verse 1, and here's what John said. My little children, these things I write unto you, that you do not transgress the law. Is he preaching obedience to Torah? Absolutely he is. He is the, verse 2, He is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. And hereby we do know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. And here, listen to Him. He's about to draw back and hit with a right hand hook that is, well, it takes boldness to say it. But here's what He said. Verse 4. He that says, I know Him. Come on, there's a lot of folks that say, I know Him. A lot of folks say, hey, I got a relationship with Him. I worship Him. He knows what's in my heart. Right? Here's what John said to that. If a man says, I know Him, and keeps not His commandments, he is a liar, and the truth's not in him. John said you can't know Him and not keep His commandments. Whoso keeps His word, in him verily is the love of Yahweh perfected. Hereby know we that we are in Him. He that says he abides in Him ought himself also to walk even as He walked. If you say Yeshua is your Savior, then you ought to walk as He walked. Did He keep Torah? You bet He did. Well, that's the message John preached. And Paul said, I went up to Jerusalem to make sure I was preaching the same message. How can we know that Paul never would teach people that they don't have to keep Torah? We can know by his personal example. He kept Torah. And we can know by his personal examination. That is, he examined his gospel against those of the apostles. If his had been different from theirs, by his own words, he said that his work would have been useless, empty, and in vain. So anyone else who is teaching things contrary to the apostles' message, anybody, if there's anybody teaching anything that contradicts Peter, James, and John, their work is vain. It's empty and useless. I understand that when you look at them, it may look like they're doing great and wonderful things. I understand they may proclaim, we have done many mighty works in His name. But Yeshua said, He will say to them, depart from me, for I know you not. If their message doesn't line up with the same message as Peter, James, and John, and they're teaching a false gospel, another gospel, Paul called it in Galatians 1. The third reason, and this will be the last one, the third way that we can know that Paul did not teach people they don't have to keep Torah is by his own personal experience. Experience. Let's read that in Galatians 1:1. Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by man, but by Yeshua HaMashiach and Yahweh the Father who raised Him from the dead. There's a lot of difference between being ordained by some denomination and being called by Yahweh. Paul was an apostle, he said, not of men, neither by man, but by Yeshua and by Yahweh who raised Him from the dead. Yeshua called Peter, James, and John. He also called Paul. He was commissioned into service by Yahweh who raised Yeshua from the dead. That was his experience. He expounds upon this experience in verse 11. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach. So the gospel he preached was taught to him by Yeshua. He was sent forth by Yahweh. Now, if those things are true, and they are true, but if those things are true, any man who thinks rationally would ask this question. Is it possible for Yahweh and Yeshua to call a man to go teach something that would be different than what Yahweh had said to Moses. If he's sent by Yahweh, does it make any sense to even imagine that Yahweh would have said one message to Moses and then said, hey, Paul, I need you to go correct a few things I said to Moses. I want to change some things up. Makes no sense, does it? It's ludicrous that he called Paul to go out and contradict what he said to Moses. Especially when we read of what he said to Moses and hear him say things like this, this shall be an ordinance forever. The Sabbath was forever established. The feasts were forever established. If Yahweh said those things were forever, would he have told Moses that they're forever and now call Paul and say, hey, go tell people I changed my mind. They really were temporary. No. See, that's ludicrous. To believe that is to believe that which is absurd. It's the epitome of what it means to be unlearned and unstable, to believe that Yahweh would send Paul to contradict what he said to Moses. Let's spend the rest of our time, and it won't take long, but let's spend the rest of our time and see what happens when somebody dares to speak against Moses. You ever thought about that? What does it mean to contradict Moses or to speak against him? Go to Numbers 12. This ought to be taught in our seminaries. The teaching in the seminaries that Yahweh changed his mind about things he said to Moses. But this is what ought to be taught. Numbers 12 verse 1. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman who he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. He did it. And they didn't like it. And they spoke against him because of what he had done. Everybody with me? They're not telling a lie about him. Verse 2. And they said, has Yahweh indeed spoken only by Moses? Has he not spoken also by us? And when you open your mouth at any point, any time, you ought to realize the truth of the next phrase. Yeah. And Yahweh heard it. They weren't talking to Yahweh, but he was listening. Now notice what they said. Yahweh speaks to us just like he does to Moses. Now that seems like an innocent statement, but because surely it's true. He had spoken to Aaron, used him mightily in Egypt. He had spoken to Miriam, given her a song that was sang after they crossed the Red Sea. Seems like an innocent statement. Moses certainly isn't the only one that Yahweh has ever spoken to. Okay? Yet, as innocent as it seems, I want you to notice how quickly that statement angered Yahweh. Now keep this in mind. Yahweh is described numerous times as being long-suffering. You know what that means? He puts up with a lot. And it's hard to bring him to that breaking point in anger. He will suffer a long time before he says, all right, I've had enough. Very patient, very merciful. But this statement made by Moses' sister upset Yahweh quickly. Immediately. He responds without hesitation. Verse 3. Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. And Yahweh spake suddenly unto Moses and unto Aaron and unto Miriam, Come out, ye three, into the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out. And Yahweh came down in the pillar of the cloud, stood in the door of the tabernacle, called Aaron and Miriam, and they came forth. And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and I'll speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all my house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And in the similitude of Yahweh shall he behold. Wherefore then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against them, and he departed. He said what he had to say, and then boom, he was gone. If you read that and don't understand how upset he is, you're misreading it. Yahweh asked them. Y'all sitting bragging about how I talk to you. Yahweh said, how is it possible that you did not fear to speak against my servant? If you knew me at all, you'd know I won't tolerate it. Wow. Yahweh's astounded that anyone would dare speak against Moses. If you read the rest of the chapter, you'll see that when Yahweh left, Miriam was immediately stricken with leprosy. And it was so bad that it terrified Aaron. And Aaron cried out to Moses, and Moses cried out to Yahweh for her healing. And Yahweh said, if she had disrespected her father and her father had spit in her face, shouldn't she have been ashamed for at least 7 days? Put her outside the camp for 7 days. The point is, when she spoke against Moses, Yahweh is saying she disrespected me. Her opinion and her words against him were showing disrespect to me. Put her outside the camp. That disrespect she showed was dealt with harshly. Today, you hear multitudes of preachers and teachers speaking against Moses without fear. Not understanding the danger they put themselves in when they dare to do that. Not understanding the disrespect they're showing to Yahweh when they do that. This one thing we know. Any preacher, any teacher who contradicts Moses has not been called by Yahweh. Go to number 16. We're going to read about a man who did not learn from Miriam's mistake. Number 16, verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, and the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown, themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and they said unto them, You take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and Yahweh is among them. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of Yahweh. And when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. When Moses heard what he had said, Moses fell on his face. You know why? Because he remembered what Yahweh had done to Miriam. And now Korah is doing worse than she did. Now Moses tries to reason with Korah and the others who are following him, but it's to little avail. We drop down to verse 23 and we read this. And Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get ye up from about the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Moses rose up, went into Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spake unto the congregation, saying, Depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be consumed in all their sins. If you stay over there with them, it's going to be counted that you're just as guilty as they. So they gat up the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and every tribe and Dathan and Abiram came out and stood in the door of their tents, and their wives and their sons and their little children. And Moses said, Hereby you shall know that Yahweh has sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of my own mind. What he means there is, I didn't divide it up that the sons of Aaron are the priests, and the sons of Levi serve in different functions in the temple, but these are the priests. He said, I didn't do that in my own mind. I did what Yahweh told me to do, and I'm about to prove that to you. He said this of Korah and those who stood with him. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then Yahweh has not sent me. But if Yahweh makes a new thing, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up, with all that appertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have provoked Yahweh. Came to pass, as he had made an end to speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. Now if you read on, this upset the rest of the congregation, and they will come back and accuse Moses of killing holy people. And as soon as they said it, it says, and the glory of Yahweh showed up. Yahweh appeared quickly as if to say, are y'all sure you want to keep pressing this matter? Like a dad stepping into a room of a bunch of disobedient children. I've told you once, I'm not going to tell you again, kind of thing. The point being, we have numerous examples that prove to us it's foolish to speak against Moses. Well, Paul's not a foolish man. Paul would not speak against Moses. Paul's called of Yahweh, an apostle sent by Yeshua and Yahweh. He would not speak against what Moses said. Go to John 5. Yeshua speaking said, I receive not honor from men, but I know you, that you have not the love of Yahweh in you. I am come in my Father's name, and you receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe which receive honor of one of another, and seek not the honor that comes from Yahweh only? That's a very real issue and problem. When people start trying to rise in their denomination, they are seeking to receive honor from others who are in the upper echelons of that denomination. And when you're trying to receive honor from them, you're going to have a hard time receiving honor from Yahweh. Verse 45. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one that accuses you, even Moses, in whom you trust. What a statement is that. Everybody run around today saying, well, we don't have to keep the law of Moses, they call it. The Mosaic law, they call it. Yeshua said, I will not accuse you to the Father. There's one that will accuse you, Moses. For had you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if you believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words? Had you believed Moses, you would believe me. If you do not believe his writings, how can you believe my words? Yeshua makes it clear that he and Moses agree 100% on everything. He and Moses do not disagree on anything. Yeshua said that he believed every jot and tittle of the law. Jots and tittles. Yeshua said everything that Moses said will be in effect for a little while. You know how long that will be? Till there's a new heaven and a new earth. Till the old heaven and the old earth has passed away, every jot and tittle of what Moses said is still in effect. Until the new heaven and the new earth comes, Moses' words are still to be followed. Every man that Yahweh calls and sends out will agree with Moses.
Yes.
Let me say it again. If they're called by Yahweh and sent by Yahweh and serve Yeshua, every one of them will agree with Moses. If they disagree with Moses, they were not sent by Yahweh.
Right.
Every man who speaks against Moses is not serving Yeshua.
Amen.
We can know that Paul never taught anyone they don't have to keep Torah. We can know it from his personal example. He kept Torah. We can know it from his personal examination. He checked his gospel against those of the other apostles. We can know it from his personal experience. That is, he's sent by Yahweh. No one sent by Yahweh contradicts what Yahweh said to Moses. Now, I'm going to wrap it up by just giving you I hope you can form this chart in your mind. I want to draw a contrast between those who believe that they don't have to keep Torah against those who believe that once you're saved, you should keep Torah. There are those who say once you have been saved by grace through faith, you don't have to keep it. And there's those who say, well, no, once you've been saved by grace through faith, you will keep it. Let's contrast the two groups. In order to believe that you don't have to keep Torah if you're saved, you had to get that belief from some preacher or teacher. Okay? And I just showed you that if there's a preacher or teacher speaking against Moses, he cannot possibly be speaking for Yahweh. But if you believe I've been saved by grace through faith, therefore I don't have to keep the law, you got that from some preacher or some teacher. All right? He got that from some book. Preachers read books and commentaries, and they teach the commandments of men as doctrines. They learn and memorize these doctrines and teach those things as if they are so. Remember Mark 7, Yeshua said, you're teaching for doctrines the commandments of men and making void the word. These are our tenets of faith. Well, your tenets of faith ought to be what's written in the Bible. Right? All right? Those who wrote the books are theologians. Theologians trace their beliefs back to the church fathers. The church fathers are men who rose up among the Gentile converts and sought to pull them away from the doctrines of the apostles. They eventually became the foundation upon which the Roman Catholic Church would spring forth and would be embraced and empowered by Constantine. And through Roman Catholicism, which is universalism, one world religion, through Roman Catholicism and through Constantine, Torah would be outlawed. They would make it illegal to observe the Sabbath. They would make it illegal to keep the feast. They would make it illegal not to eat pork. They would teach legalism is disobedience to God. Just like that preacher does. See? So in order to be someone who believes that Torah does not have to be kept by those who have been saved by grace through faith, you can trace that belief to a preacher who twisted the writings of Paul, who read a book that twisted the writings of Paul, because you're not going to find any other epistle that teaches such a thing. And those books were written by theologians who traced their doctrinal beliefs back to the doctrines of the church fathers, and the church fathers are reprobates who set in motion Torah becoming illegal. But if you believe that you're saved by grace through faith and you should keep Torah, you probably got that from some teacher who was rightly dividing the word. Who got that from apostles like Peter, James, and John. Who understood that Paul's writings are hard to be understood. Who understood that to speak against Moses is to be seduced into the error of lawlessness. And then you also understand that the apostles got their teaching from who? Yeshua. And Yeshua taught what? The writings of Moses. And Moses got what he wrote from where? From Yahweh himself. Yahweh said, I spoke to him mouth to mouth. So, let me summarize it just to make sure we get it. If a person believes that they are saved by grace through faith but don't have to keep Torah, that can only be traced back as far as the church fathers. You can't find it anywhere else. It is a corruption that led to the rise of Catholicism, that led to the rise of every denomination on the earth today.
Yes.
It's an evil wickedness.
Yes.
It can't be traced to the apostles. None of them taught that garbage. Can't be taught to Yeshua. Yeshua said, don't even think I came to destroy the law of the prophets. It'll stand as long as heaven and earth stand. So as far as you can go back is the church fathers. But if you believe that you're saved by grace through faith, and that you're supposed to walk in Torah, keep Torah, obey Torah, you can trace that all the way back to Moses, straight to Yahweh.
Yes.
Which one sounds better? If any man preach any other gospel, let him be accursed. Paul preached the exact same gospel that Peter, James, and John preached. Peter, James, and John preached the same gospel that Yeshua preached. Yeshua preached the same gospel that Moses preached, and Moses got it straight from Yahweh. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. As His name is put upon you, so shall He bless you.